Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. I am excited to welcome you to our second talk of the year, our first adult ed program of the year, with author Daniel Schulman. He's the author of a book called The Money Kings, the epic story of the Jewish immigrants who transformed Wall Street and shaped modern America. Just a little bit about our author. Daniel Schulman is a New York Times bestselling author of Sons of Wichita, a biography of the Koch family that was a finalist for the Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year award. He's the deputy editor for News and Politics for Mother Jones, which I can only imagine. We were talking a little bit before things started, and I can only imagine what it's like being the news and politics editor for anything these days in America. He lives in Massachusetts with his wife and sons, although he is a born and bred New Yorker, but we'll forgive him for leaving us for northern regions. And it's just really wonderful to have him here. So without any further ado, Daniel, we turn things over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm just going to share my screen here with you and show you a few slides. Okay. So Jews and money, not a loaded topic at all, right? I'm glad we can all agree on that. My new book, The Money Kings, is about some of the most powerful and influential German Jewish bankers in modern American history. The founders of Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, and J&W Seligman and Company. Kuhn Loeb's Jacob Schiff, who was a financier of such towering status, his lifetime was sometimes known as the Schiff era. They shaped the rise of Wall Street and our modern economic system. They helped to create the Federal Reserve and the progressive income tax. They advised presidential administrations on financial and foreign policy. And they shaped the very demographics of the United States by making it possible for millions of Jews to come to this nation and to thrive here. A century after their time, their imprint still is all around us. In some ways, you might even say that the Schiff era never ended. But just to recap, fantastically wealthy Jews with world-changing legacies. No controversy here at all, right? Joking aside, I almost didn't write The Money Kings. Could anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists point to this display of Jewish power and say, aha, I told you so? Yet I also noticed that it was the conspiracy mongers who seem most devoted to keeping the memory of Schiff and his allies alive, but for all the wrong reasons, and in accounts that were filled with half-truth.
I sent it to you again.
And outright lies.
Yes, and I sent you my thing. So the email.
It troubled me to think how anti-Semitism can shape how we present history itself. It troubled me to think twice about documenting this history and situating Schiff and his allies as not just some of the most important actors in modern Jewish history, but in American history itself. And I think this is an important point. This is American history, not just Jewish history. I first began working on this book about 10 years ago. My eldest son was an infant at the time. He just entered the 4th grade. The research took me all over the place, from the German State Department in Berlin, where I was able to comb through diplomatic cables and intelligence records from World War I, to the Rothschild archive in London. I even visited Norman, Oklahoma, where improbably the ledgers of the firm J&W Seligman and Company ended up. But I want to tell you about one of the most fascinating places that I visited, not too far from where you are now. It's a place that sort of brought this whole story together for me. It's called Salem Fields, and it's an old cemetery that straddles Brooklyn and Queens. Perhaps some of you are familiar with it. It was established 175 years ago by the congregation of Temple Emmanuel, the Reformed synagogue in Manhattan that was the Mecca of the German Jewish elite. You drive through the granite archway and you're transported to another world. The cemetery is filled with grand mausoleums of varying ostentation. And what's interesting about Salem Fields is that so many of the through lines of the past converge here. And you can begin to visualize the guideposts of the modern financial age and the modern age itself, really. The names you see as you walk the winding paths are familiar ones: Bloomingdale and Guggenheim, Goldman, Sachs, Lehman. Their proximity and death hinted in many cases at their closeness, at the closeness of some of these families in life. High on a hillside overlooking many of the rest of these mausoleums is one that looks like you might find it somewhere on Mount Olympus. And this is the final resting place of the financier and philanthropist Jacob Schiff. Now, Schiff is not very well remembered today, but he was a colossus of finance and Jewish life. J.P. Morgan, who was Schiff's contemporary, he's widely considered the greatest banker of the Gilded Age and perhaps the most pivotal financial figure in modern American history. Yet Schiff, who was the head of the investment bank of Kuhn Loeb, could easily assert a claim to that title. This is a photograph of the Schiff, Loeb, and Warburg families. One thing I found as I was researching this book is that the family trees of many of these clans that I write about were quite interwoven, such as the Goldman and Sachs families, but you really see it here with the Schiff, Loebs, and Warburgs. Jacob Schiff and his wife are sort of center down in the front, and up to the right on the balcony is an interesting figure, a fellow named Otto Kahn that some people might be familiar with. He was one of Schiff's business partners, but he was one of the best known moguls of the Gilded Age, sort of a playboy type who also had a role in helping to fundraise for the Metropolitan Opera. One piece of trivia is that he's thought to be part of the inspiration for the Monopoly Man. Schiff was the unelected but undisputed leader of America's Jewish community. He was one of the most famous financiers of his time, not just here in the United States, but internationally as well. And he presided over a philanthropic era that is really unparalleled in modern American history, hence the Schiff era that I mentioned earlier. Schiff was a man who bridged two different worlds: the opulent and rarefied world of the German Jewish elite, and the world of the often impoverished immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe who lived on the Lower East Side. My paternal grandparents, who immigrated from what is now present-day Ukraine, were part of this second category. They lived in a tenement in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, far from the happenings on Wall Street or on the Upper East Side, but they would have known the name Jacob Schiff. I'll paint you a quick picture of how he was viewed during his lifetime, and some of these headlines from the New York Times after his death sort of emphasize the point. But on the day of his funeral in 1920, the streets of the Lower East Side were eerily quiet. They were empty. The push carts that populated the neighborhood were shuttered, as were the storefronts, and many of them had placards tucked in their windows which read in English and in Hebrew, "The East Side mourns the loss of Jacob H. Schiff." Hundreds of condolence telegrams poured in from around the world, many of them from world leaders and dignitaries. President Woodrow Wilson sent a cable to Schiff's family lamenting the loss of one of the nation's, quote, most useful citizens. Uptown, the pews of Temple Emmanuel, where the service was held, were filled with VIPs and celebrities. The presidents of the Union Pacific and Pennsylvania Railroads, a current ambassador and a future one, the mining magnate Daniel Guggenheim, Julius Rosenwald, who was one of the co-founders of Sears, Adolph Ox, the publisher of the New York Times, and James Wilson, who was the Civil War general who captured Jefferson Davis. These prominent men were just part of the contingent of pallbearers. But the sight of these famous tycoons and politicians within the temple paled next to the spectacle that was playing out outside. As Schiff's funeral procession traveled down Fifth Avenue, it was greeted by a crowd of thousands. Many of these were poor immigrants from the East Side who had trekked all the way uptown to pay their respects to Schiff and who bowed their heads low as his casket passed. After the service, members of this crowd joined the procession as it headed uptown on the way to the Queensboro Bridge, and from there to Schiff's final resting place at the Salem Field Cemetery. Now, Schiff is the central figure in my new book, but you can't tell his story without including the remarkable group of German Jewish families who formed his business, social, and philanthropic circle. And I'm talking about the founding families of Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Kuhn Loeb, and J&W Seligman and Company. I'm often asked about the title of my book. Why did I name it Money Kings? Does it have anti-Semitic connotations? And as I mentioned earlier, I wrestled with whether to write this story at all. Ultimately, I thought it was important to tell it in an unvarnished way, because within this book is the story of how myths of Jewish money and power came to be. And we're going to circle back to that in a little bit. But as for the title Money Kings, that comes from the term that the pundits and papers of the Gilded Age used to describe the biggest tycoons of that era. It wasn't just a term for Jewish bankers. Schiff was a money king, but so was J.P. Morgan. Now, I wouldn't hesitate to write about Morgan or Rockefeller and call that book Money King. So why would I be reluctant to write a book about Schiff or Marcus Goldman and call it the same? Who were they, if not money kings? If I'd called the book something else like Jewish Titans or something of that nature, I think I would have been doing a disservice to the subjects of this story. Their accomplishments, irrespective of religion, were amazing on their own terms. And I come back to this notion that their stories are central to American and world history, not just Jewish history. But as you review the biographies of the Money Kings, it's a little remarkable that they were ever written into conspiracy theories in the first place. In this slide here, you see the Lehman Brothers. Meyer is on the left and Emanuel is on the right. Their older brother, Henry, who died in the 1850s of yellow fever, was the first to come to the United States from Bavaria. He was a peddler in Alabama and eventually opened a store in Montgomery, which would soon become the state capital. Excuse me. At the time, our currency system was quite unreliable. This was before the federal government issued paper money, and a variety of banks across the country issued their own notes. Many of the banknotes in circulation at the time were in fact counterfeit, and this would eventually lead to the creation of the Secret Service. But because the currency system was so haphazard, commodities such as cotton were traded in place of money, especially in the South. And this is how the Lehmans eventually entered the cotton business, which was the foundation of their financial empire. They accepted cotton in exchange for goods and slowly grew more and more immersed in this business before branching out into trading a variety of other commodities such as sugar, coffee, oil, etc. In these pictures, we have the Goldman and Sachs families. To the left is Samuel Sachs, one of the founding partners of the firm. Goldman Sachs was founded by another immigrant peddler, Marcus Goldman, Samuel's father-in-law, who arrived in the U.S. in the late 1840s and was part of a major wave of German and German Jewish immigration unleashed by revolutions that had occurred throughout Europe. These immigrants were often known as 48ers. These revolutions were uprisings against feudalism, and while the exact rationale differed from place to place, at the heart of these protests was a call for basic equal rights, and this was a cause that was particularly compelling to Jews, especially in the German states, who lacked many basic freedoms in that era. The protests of 1848 and 1849 were pretty brutally put down, and many immigrants who came to the United States at that time were fleeing for their lives. By some accounts, Meyer Lehman, whose picture you saw on the previous slide, participated in the uprisings before joining his brothers in Alabama. Here we have Joseph and Jesse Seligman, two of the 8 brothers who composed the Seligman banking dynasty. Their up from nothing tale brings to mind the Horatio Alger archetype, and there's actually a good reason for this. For a number of years, Horatio Alger was the live-in tutor for Joseph's children, and Joseph and Alger spent many an evening as Joseph recounted his story. Joseph came to the United States from Bavaria in the late 1830s, and he settled in Pennsylvania first. After clerking at a dry goods business, he set out to make his fortune as a peddler. The Seligman story is representative of how chains of migration worked. Based on Joseph's experiences in the United States, and presumably based on the effusive letters he was writing home about the magical opportunities available here, one brother came over after the next, and eventually the entire Seligman clan had relocated to the United States. The Seligmans, like the Lehmans, gravitated south at first, and they established a few dry goods firms in Alabama, but unlike the Lehmans, they returned north prior to the Civil War. On this next slide, we have Solomon Loeb and Abraham Kuhn, the namesakes of the Kuhn-Loeb Investment Bank. Over the years, the Kuhn-Loeb name disappeared from Wall Street, but at one time, it was one of the most powerful and best-known investment banks in the world. In the 1970s, in fact, Kuhn-Loeb merged with Lehman Brothers, and the merged firm was later acquired by American Express. And at that point, the Kuhn-Loeb name vanished altogether. But Solomon Loeb and Abraham Kuhn were brothers-in-law twice over. Abraham married Solomon's sister, and Solomon later married Abraham's sister. Abraham was the first to establish himself in the United States, and he and his brothers peddled in Indiana and eventually opened a dry goods store in Lafayette. Solomon joined his sister and his new brother-in-law in Indiana, and the Kuhns and the Loebs eventually moved to Cincinnati, which had both a large German and a large German Jewish population. Cincinnati was at the center of the clothing trade at the time, and Kuhn and Loeb established a thriving clothing business there. But by now, you're probably sensing that there's a pattern here. German Jews from Bavaria who got their start peddling. Amazingly, firms such as Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs emerged from the rucksacks and horse-drawn carts of immigrant peddlers who had come to the United States in the mid-1800s, seeking opportunities that were closed to them in Germany. I'd mentioned earlier that Germany was a pretty inhospitable place, especially to Jews, where they were barred from most all professions other than mercantile ones, prohibited from property ownership, told where they could and couldn't go, and where they could and couldn't live. Now, I'm often asked why 19th century Jewish immigrants gravitated towards peddling. And the answer is really that peddling was the most common startup profession because it was a familiar one. This job, this type of mercantile role, was one of the few roles available to their fathers and grandfathers in the old country. So this is what they fell into in the United States. The great-grandson of one of the founders of Lehman Brothers called peddling the Harvard Business School for Jewish boys. And there's certainly an element of truth to that. Peddling offered a crash course in business in the English language, in American traditions and customs. To be successful, you had to be resourceful, somewhat adventurous, and you had to quickly establish rapport with your customers. All of these characteristics would suit them well later in business. Now, in every case, all of these firms pivoted to finance right after the Civil War, and there was a reason for that. For one thing, these firms were well established when the war erupted, and they were able to get government contracts to supply clothing and other necessities. With the exception of the Lehmans, who were based in Alabama and aligned themselves with the Confederacy, these were union contracts. Now, a word about the Lehmans. They very rapidly assimilated to Southern life, and this was interesting given how they were perceived when they arrived in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1840s. One fascinating source of information on the Lehmans that I found and used in my research were old credit report volumes. Now, credit reporters from R.G. and Dunn and Company fanned out across the country, rating the credit of many different businesses, and their observations were often not dull. In the case of the Lehmans, when they arrived in Montgomery, the credit reporter immediately zeroed in on their Jewishness. They were members of the tribe, and as such, a close watch needed to be kept on them, the notation read. They weren't to be trusted, they weren't respectable. Yet, on the eve of the Civil War, so a little bit more than a decade later, they were viewed quite differently. The credit reports noted that they were respectable businessmen, their business was in good standing, and it even noted that they were considered almost as good as white men, and that's a quote. The Lehmans owned slaves, and in the Reconstruction era, if not before, their firm helped to manage plantations. So they had really immersed themselves in Southern life, in the Southern culture. But how did they reconcile as Jews? How did they reconcile this as Jews, whose foundational story is the flight from Egyptian bondage? Now, of course, they weren't alone. Many Jews acculturated to Southern life and the slaveholding culture. But the hypocrisy of this, even then, was lost on no one. There was a pre-Civil War congressional debate in which a senator who was rebuking one of his colleagues, a Jewish senator from Alabama named Judah Benjamin, referenced Israelites with Egyptian principles. Now, the Lehmans did a considerable amount of business with the Confederate government during the war, fulfilling contracts for fabric used in uniforms, for coffee, and for other necessities. And Meyer Lehman's stature as a Southern businessman was such that in late 1864, shortly before the war concluded, he was selected by Alabama's governor to undertake a mission to Richmond, Virginia, the seat of the Confederate government, where he actually met with Jefferson Davis himself. His mission was to get a large shipment of cotton through the enemy lines and sell it in the North in exchange for medicine, food, and for clothing that could be provided to Confederate POWs held in Northern prisons. There are actually letters from Meyer to Ulysses S. Grant seeking passage through the battle lines. Now, he was never able to complete this mission, but it does give you an interesting glimpse into the rise of the Lehmans in the South. Now, financing the war required large-scale bond-selling operations on both sides, and it really hastened the financialization of American life. Firms such as Lehman and Seligman and Company dipped a toe into finance during the Civil War by selling war bonds in Europe. And by the war's end, the clothing and dry goods businesses were really flooded with new entrants who were flocking towards these government contracts. These entrepreneurs were quick to see that the cream was off the business, as the son of Kuhn Loeb founder Solomon Loeb put it. And they were equally quick to see the possibilities that banking and finance offered as the United States entered a new era. And they had the capital and contacts to make that leap. Now, in these pictures, to the right is a flyer for war bonds being sold by J. Cook and Company, one of the predominant sellers of Union war bonds. And to the left is Meyer Lehman's post-Civil War pardon application. I was actually able to find the letters that both brothers wrote after the war requesting pardons. And interestingly, both played down the extent of their financial involvement and said that they weren't in favor of secession. They also were not quite truthful about the extent of their assets. You weren't eligible for a pardon, at least in this round of pardons, if you had holdings over $20,000. And both brothers claimed they had less than that, which vastly overstated their wealth at that time. Unlike the earlier generation of German Jewish immigrants who had arrived in the U.S. in the mid-1800s, Jacob Schiff came to America in 1865, directly after the Civil War had concluded, and he did not arrive by way of steerage like Joseph Seligman or the Lehmans. He hailed from a prominent family in Frankfurt's Jewish community. Schiff's descendants occupied one of the grandest homes in Frankfurt's Jewish quarter, which you can see in one of these slides. It was a two-family home, and what was fascinating is that Meyer Rothschild, who was the patriarch of the Rothschild banking dynasty, actually bought this home from the Schiffs in the late 1700s. Before Schiff was 20, he had co-founded a brokerage, and he had plunged into railroad finance, which was a sort of unruly realm at that time. He would soon marry into the Kuhn-Loeb banking family, and he very quickly became its most important partner. Over the next 50 years, he piloted Kuhn-Loeb to the very top strata of American and international finance. His only real equal on Wall Street was J.P. Morgan. Schiff channeled hundreds of millions, maybe billions, of European investment capital into American industry, especially the railroads. One of his signature feats was the turnaround and restoration of the bankrupt Union Pacific railroad system. But he was also a banker to iconic 20th century companies such as Western Union and Westinghouse. He played a vital role in transforming the United States from an emerging market into an economic superpower. The orbit of German Jewish dynasties that Schiff occupied also played a vital role in the development of modern economy and the policies and institutions that undergird it. Paul Warburg, pictured here, was Schiff's partner in Kuhn-Loeb, and he was his brother-in-law. He was one of the architects of the Federal Reserve System. When Paul came to the United States in the early 1900s, the U.S. still lacked a central bank, which placed us in the minority among major world economies. Our currency was inelastic. In other words, there was a fixed supply that did not contract or expand based on demand. This caused frequent financial panics and shocks and bank runs. Warburg led the push to create a central bank, and he served on the first Federal Reserve Board. World War I erupted just as the Federal Reserve Board got underway. And because of his German background and suspicions about his allegiances, Warburg's term on the board was not renewed by Woodrow Wilson. But he would continue to play a formative role in international finance for the remainder of his life. And he would play a leading but futile part, along with John Maynard Keynes, who's the British economist, in pushing the Allies to reduce German war reparations in the aftermath of World War I. This is Edwin Seligman, son of the banker Joseph Seligman. Edwin was a Columbia University economist and one of the leading crusaders for levying a federal income tax. He was crucial to the effort to ratify the 16th Amendment that authorized a federal income tax. And he was also one of the intellectual forefathers of progressive taxation on which our tax system is based. Now, here we have Henry Goldman and Philip Lehman, who were childhood friends whose fathers had co-founded Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers, respectively. Together, they formed an alliance between their family firms to underwrite the type of consumer and retail businesses ignored by the top investment banks. J.P. Morgan and other major investment firms concentrated largely on railroads and industrial concerns, whose share value was often pegged to their physical assets. But Goldman and Lehman believed intangibles, such as future earning power and goodwill, in other words, customer loyalty and the power of the brand, those sorts of things, could and should be factored into share pricing. They wound up helping to pioneer the modern IPO. Sears and Woolworth are just a sampling of the many household name businesses that grew and thrived as a result of their financial innovation. The legacy of the financial dynasties I write about in my book went far beyond finance. Especially in Jacob Schiff's case, their philanthropic legacy rivaled, if not surpassed, their financial one. Between 1890 and 1920, the decade Schiff was most active. The Jewish population of the United States swelled from 400,000 to 3.4 million. These immigrants were fleeing increasingly oppressive living conditions and flare-ups of mob violence targeting Jewish communities, often abetted by or just ignored by local authorities. The deluge of immigration predictably caused a nativist backlash, and politicians began stoking fears of disease-carrying foreign criminals who were stealing American jobs and contributing to the moral and cultural decay of American society. Does that sound familiar? This debate really hasn't traveled terribly far in the past 140 years. For years, Schiff and his philanthropic and his fellow philanthropic stewards beat back nativist efforts to block Jewish immigration. To ensure these new arrivals would not become a burden on public resources, Schiff and his allies essentially struck a bargain with political leaders. They would shoulder the weighty obligation to take care of their own, and that's exactly what they did. They poured millions into efforts to help Jews in the United States and abroad. Job training programs, schools, hospitals, English lessons. Schiff helped to found and fund organizations that provided these services and a whole lot more. Not only did he and fellow Jewish philanthropists anticipate the immediate needs of the new arrivals, they paved the way for their rapid Americanization. Many of the organizations they founded and funded during that era still exist. They include the Educational Alliance, the 92nd Street Y, the YMHA, the Henry Street Settlement, the American Jewish Committee, the Joint Distribution Committee. I could go on. Now, this philanthropy wasn't always entirely selfless. There was also a self-interested aspect of it. Quite simply, they understood that this flood of impoverished provincial immigrants, who the German Jewish elite really shared very little in common with other than their religion, could easily tarnish their own very hard-fought standing within the American social hierarchy. Now, by the early 1900s, conditions on the Lower East Side had become a really big problem. It was a haven for drugs, prostitution, and crime. Jewish gangsters and criminals who had names like Jaime Hundred and Stiff Rivka ruled those streets. And things came to a head when New York's police commissioner wrote an article stating that 50% of the city's criminal element were Jews. Now, this wasn't true, but that didn't make it any less alarming or dangerous. The response to this by Schiff and his allies was remarkable, and it was telling. They hired a detective to penetrate and basically map out the landscape of the Jewish criminal underworld of the Lower East Side. And they partnered with the police to target and prosecute these criminals and basically purge the criminals from this neighborhood. Their attempts at image management were visible elsewhere too. For a time, the German Jewish philanthropic stewards attempted ill-fated schemes to deflect Jewish immigrants away from New York City and into the more sparsely settled parts of the country. One of Schiff's signature efforts was called the Galveston Movement. It sounds a bit outlandish today, but the idea was to prevent immigrants from even setting foot in New York City by routing them directly to Galveston, Texas, and from there to locations in the interior. If you can't understand why some of your Jewish relatives ended up in, say, Missouri, now you have an answer. There were many skirmishes between the German Jews and the new arrivals, and resentments over the somewhat haughty and paternalistic posture of the Germans toward their brethren existed for generations, in some cases still exists. But nevertheless, on a very basic level, if you hail from an American Jewish family with Russian or Eastern European roots, as I do, there's a very good possibility your American story would not have been written without them. World War I was a defining moment globally, of course, and it was an especially dramatic time for the German Jewish community in the United States. The war fractured families and firms, and it challenged the identities of men such as Jacob Schiff. Schiff had often spoken proudly of what he called the trinity of his heritage as a German, as an American, and as a Jew. And this war would bring his identity into bitter conflict, especially as public opinion turned against Germany after the sinking of the Lusitania. Schiff largely refused to allow his firm to bankroll the combatants, and this had a lasting effect on his firm, Kuhn Loeb, which was branded pro-German and really lost quite a bit of its stature as a result. The war and the differing allegiances of the partners became an existential crisis within Goldman Sachs. Sam Sachs was staunchly pro-ally, as was the case with many second-generation German Americans. Henry Goldman, Marcus's son, on the other hand, was staunchly and outspokenly pro-German, and this caused a crisis within the firm. Eventually, Henry Goldman resigned, and he was the last Goldman to work for the firm that his father founded, and this rift rippled throughout the family. World War I was the gateway to a sad and tragic chapter in the story of the Money Kings. Schiff and his allies believed they were on the cusp of a new era, one in which ancient prejudices and stereotypes were receding. And they had been diligent about trying to stamp out anti-Semitism wherever they saw it. But not only would anti-Semitism come roaring back in a new and virulent form during the early 20th century, but Schiff and his friends would figure prominently in those conspiracy theories that persist to this day, in fact. One thing that really amazed me while writing this book was just how much modern anti-Semitism, related but distinct from the ancient variety, traces back to just one man. You probably know him as America's foremost automaker, but Henry Ford was also, and perhaps more consequentially, the nation's leading purveyor of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and lies through his Dearborn Independent newspaper. Over a period of 7 years and 92 issues, the Dearborn Independent attacked Jews for everything you could imagine, from causing financial panics and wars to wrecking American baseball. The Independent's anti-Jewish screeds were based in large part on the themes of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a forged document that purported to reveal the Jewish master plan for world domination by, among other things, asserting financial control. The fact that this was a forgery was well known by the early 1920s, but that didn't stop Ford's operation from churning out this propaganda week after week. The Dearborn Independent reached a huge audience in the United States. It was one of the nation's most widely circulated papers. It was available in all the Ford dealerships. But if this wasn't enough, Ford's operations collected these articles into 4 volumes, which it called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. Not just a problem, the world's biggest problem. Millions of copies were printed around the world, including in Germany, where in the 1920s, the up-and-coming Nazi movement blanketed the country with copies. When a New York Times reporter visited Hitler in the early 1920s, he noted that Hitler had a large portrait of Ford on the wall of his office, and the tables of the anteroom to this office were covered with copies of the International Jew. When today you hear anti-Semitic code, such as international banker or globalist, or more overt attacks on people like George Soros, know that this all flows from what Ford helped to unleash upon the world a century ago. When I started this project 10 years ago, I knew the stories of Schiff and his contemporaries were important. What I didn't fully recognize was just how relevant their stories would be. I've been surprised by the many modern echoes from that era. The ongoing immigration wars, the debate over tech monopolies and income inequality, the skirmishes we're seeing in and outside of the Jewish community about the Zionist movement and about Israel. All of that was present then as it is now. sadly, anti-Semitism too is on the rise, and the world of over a century ago, the world of the money kings, seems closer than it ever was. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
That was a lot of information and super interesting. And I'm sure that there are questions here. So if you have a question, if you could either just let me know in the comments or raise your hand electronically, and I will call you. But it looks like Ellen Meshnick, you were about to raise your hand. So yes or no? No. Okay. So I'm going to start with Marcia and Mark.
Yeah. Yeah. Where'd I go? Unmute. Okay. Hi. Thank you
Hi.
so much for this presentation. And I haven't read most of the book yet, but I started reading it at the suggestion of two people who were in this audience that both raved about it and loved your book. So I'm about a quarter of the way through. And I guess just one comment that is only tangential to your presentation is that some of the things you've brought up just coincidentally overlap with topics in other books we're going to be doing in our Port Jewish Center book club over the course of the year. And totally coincidentally, have you heard of a book called all right, what'd I do with it? The Last Ships from Hamburg?
I have. I know the author a little bit. We sort of met after our books. We met at least online after our books came out. It's sort of a very strange coincidence that both these books came out at the same time, with Schiff as a major figure. But it's interesting because we sort of tell different tales. But I would certainly recommend reading his book as well.
Right, because I had read that blurb and suggested that book and your book, and I started reading this and went, oh my goodness, how well does this dovetail?
Yes.
And then that we're doing that one in December, and then January we've got The Incorruptibles by Dan Slater, which is
what a great story that is. And I'm glad that he ended up doing that book, because when I referred to Stiff Rivka and Jaime Hundred, who I assume will come up in Dan Slater's book, when I was doing this research, I was saying to myself, darn, that's a really good book in its own right. It gets about a chapter in mine, but I'm sure it's quite a story.
Right, and I didn't connect the dots on that until you referenced the German Jewish community trying to clean up the Lower East Side and all. So
yeah,
there you have it.
Yep,
everything's connected.
It is.
But thank you. So far, I'm really enjoying this book. So
well, thank you so much for reading. Appreciate it.
Yep.
I'm bringing in Nancy Solomon. Nancy, your question.
Thank you so much for writing this book.
Sure.
I was really so glad to see how in-depth your research has been, especially a lot of the people, are very quick to dismiss Jewish families' role in perpetuating slavery in the South. And I was also just very, glad to see the differences of class discussion among the various families. I'm still probably about a third of the way through your book right now. And my question is, did you wrestle with what to do about covering Bernie Madoff?
I mean, I can't say that I did, just because he wasn't really a thread that I was following in this book. But I mean, the Madoff story is a fascinating one in its own right, and has certainly been the subject of a number of of books and films and that sort of thing. But you mentioned the topic of slavery, and I think this comes back to the issue of not really sugarcoating anything. I think it's important to tell the story as it was. So it's credible. I mean, obviously, but that also includes, exploding some of the myths and stereotypes that have been perpetuated over the years, and showing the origins and the phony origins in many cases of them. But I don't think we should be afraid of telling the story of people like Bernie Madoff because he happened to be a Jewish financier. There are plenty of non-Jewish financiers who are also crooked, and that fact has nothing to do with their Jewishness or their non-Jewishness.
Thanks, Nancy. I'm gonna go to Mitchell now, and then Miranda, you'll come after Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schulman, for writing your book and for this presentation. And I had a couple of questions that relate to my own, I guess, personal connection, slight though it may be, to Jacob Schiff. And I was very interested to hear what you had to say about his life and work in the United States. So my grandparents belonged to a congregation in the Bronx called Schiff Center. At the time that I was familiar with it, which was in the 60s, it was a conservative congregation, although it had the appearance of being built as an Orthodox synagogue because it had a balcony. And so I was wondering if you could say anything about the relationship of the Jacob Schiff and the Schiff family in terms of philanthropy for synagogues in the United States. And the other thing I knew about him, or at least his family, was the ownership of the New York Post. When I was an avid Post reader in the 1960s, Dorothy Schiff was the publisher. And I was wondering if you had anything you could say about the relationship of him to getting involved in American journalism.
That's an interesting question. Now, I was not aware of the Schiff Synagogue in the Bronx, so I will need to research that more fully. Schiff during his lifetime gave away so much money. It was sort of hard to track it when the New York Times tried to assemble a full picture of his philanthropy after his death. They actually said they couldn't do it because in many cases his gifts were anonymous. But it went to all sorts of different venues. I hadn't heard of him funding synagogues before, but that's fascinating. And your second question was about journalism. Dorothy Schiff who was the publisher of the New York Post, New York doyen, was Schiff's granddaughter. And, by the time that she got involved with the Post, he had long since passed. But, he was an early investor in the New York Times and had a very close relationship, sometimes a bit of a contentious relationship, with Adolph Ochs, who was the publisher of the Times. And it was interesting, Schiff was always sending missives to Ochs about the latest pogrom and trying to get coverage of this in the paper. Sometimes he was successful, sometimes he wasn't. What he took umbrage to sometimes was when the Times covered his business deals negatively. But Schiff also helped to fund some Jewish newspapers in New York as well.
Thank you for that question, Mitchell. We're going to go to Miranda now.
Thanks. I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you so much for your book, which was absolutely fascinating. I read it. I couldn't put it down. And I was very, very impressed towards the end of the book. You start talking about Max Warburg, who saved about 40,000 Jews. He was in Germany at the time, and he figured out how to get them visas and get them out, even though the family was like begging him to leave. And that is such a wonderful story. And I was also blown away by Paul Warburg saying that, hey, he predicted the stock market crash. and was urging, he wrote a letter to the New York Times, and he was urging people, you know, we've got a big problem here. And
Yeah.
some people listened, and so their firms survived. But those stories I thought were just incredible.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, the Warburgs just have an incredible story in their own right, and Ron Chernow wrote a great book about the whole sprawling Warburg family called the Warburgs, which is quite remarkable. But you know, Max Warburg, who was the eldest of the Warburg brothers and ran the Bank of M.M. Warburg in Hamburg, which is still there to this day, in the same place it's been for hundreds of years. He really had some blind spots about the ascendant Nazi movement, and he stayed in Germany far longer than perhaps he should have. But his connections sort of allowed him to get out. But what you're referring to is, you know, he was involved in what was called the Havara Agreement, which was controversial because it was essentially making a deal with the Nazi government, where they would allow Jews to get their assets out of the country, and they could immigrate to Israel, immigrate to Palestine at that time. But they had to use their assets to buy German goods. So they were essentially helping to fund the Nazis in the process. But there's no question that helped to save tens of thousands of people and get them out of the country.
Thanks for that question, Miranda. I'm going to go to Bill Keller.
First of all, in the early mid 80s to early mid 90s, I worked for the Lehman Brothers. I was not surprised when they brought down the U.S. economy, because at that point it wasn't a very well managed firm. But never mentioned slavery in any of the official histories that we received. The Lehman trilogy never mentioned slavery, which I recalled when I saw it, but then I also read, you know, a review about that. So, you know, they definitely tried to ignore that part of their background. But I actually wanted to go to your previous book about the Koch family, mm-hmm. and see, you know, looking at that sort of, you know, institutional white, you know, Midwest family that's funded the, you know, right-wing movements to such an extent in this country, and then comparing that to, you know, what happened with the Jewish people. Did you see any similarities as you were writing the books? Or
that's a very good question that I was actually recently thinking about. You know, I often get asked this question, and, you know, really the connective tissue, I think, between these books is this idea of how people use this idea of legacy and dynasty, and how people are able to use money to influence a variety of things. You know, one thing that the Kochs did in order to create an infrastructure for mainstreaming libertarianism, which is what they were trying to do, was they funded an array of organizations. But Charles Koch also kept very close control of these organizations. He wasn't the sort of contributor who would just, you know, cut a check and walk away. Schiff was the exactly the same way. You know, he did not believe in, you know, just handing out checks. He wanted to be involved intimately with these projects, and, you know, it was to the point of micromanagement. When he was one of the founders of Montefiore Home, now Montefiore Hospital, and, you know, every Sunday he would be at the hospital going over the cases and deciding who would and would not, you know, get a bed there. So there are definitely similarities in that sort of mentality, but there are also similarities in terms of building an infrastructure. So the Kochs had, you know, think tanks, political advocacy groups, that sort of thing. the needs of the Jewish community obviously were different. So there were, aid organizations, organizations that focused on teaching people English and, job training, those sorts of things. But in the same regard, there was a network of these nonprofits. So there are similarities in that sense.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, for that question. We're going to go to our last question, which is coming from Judy Epstein.
Thank you. I want to thank you for writing the book, and I want to thank you for coming and talking about it.
Pleasure.
I learned a lot. First of all, I think that the New York Film Festival needs a film, The Stiff Rifkin Story. Maybe we could interest De Niro or somebody like that. Sounds irresistible. But I also, more seriously, my question is, I agree with you not to shy away from writing this, but I'm wondering, what was your spark of inspiration in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I was sort of, after I had published the Koch book, I was looking around for another big, meaty topic. And the Koch book was, current events in part, but there was a big historical component of it. And I spent a lot of time in archives sort of digging into their past. And that was one thing that I enjoyed. So I wanted to write history, and I was looking for a subject. And honestly, I sort of fell into the Schiff story accidentally. I was initially considering doing a book about the wave of anarchist violence that took place in the United States in the early 1900s. And it basically, a number of Wall Street figures were targeted with letter bombs. And this whole campaign of violence culminated with the bombing of Wall Street in 1920, which I write about a little bit in my book. But one of the names that came up was Jacob Schiff as a recipient of a letter bomb. And, his name sort of faintly rang a bell. I knew he was sort of part of that set of Gilded Age tycoons, but I didn't know much about him. And as I started just doing some cursory research on his life, my eyes sort of started popping out. He had just been involved. He turned around the Union Pacific Railroad. He funded the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. There were so many fascinating episodes about his life, and that's what pulled me into the story. And then I realized that my own family, despite the fact that our circumstances couldn't have been any different. I mean, my grandparents were, poor immigrants from Eastern Europe who lived in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. But I realized that their stories were connected, and that it really wouldn't have been, it might not have been possible for them to have settled in the United States and to make their lives here absent Schiff and the Money King. So that's sort of how I arrived at this book.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for that question, Judy. And actually, Arnie Suture, I am sorry, I did not see that you had your hand raised. So I am going to turn things to you. Just unmute yourself as you can.
No. Okay.
You got it.
Am I in? Okay. Many years ago, I think it was in late 50s or the 60s, they would a book, Our Crowd, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Many of the people were the same, but there's a lot of different people mentioned in that book. And I'm just wondering about the connection, if it's at the same time that these people came over. I know the other, Our Crowd was basically in the mid 80s. And this seems to be the same. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, Our Crowd tells some of the same stories. It's about some of the same. It's about some of the same families. It branches out into the whole world of Our Crowd, which composed this sort of large German Jewish elite aristocracy who inhabited the largely the Upper East Side. You know, that was ended up being largely a social history, and I decided that I wanted to do really a financial and philanthropic one that really focused in on a handful of very closely intertwined families and firms. And that's why I'm looking at Goldman. That's why I'm looking at Kuhn Loeb and Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers and J&W Seligman Company. Going back to this point I made earlier about just these families, even, you know, being intertwined through marriage and business and philanthropy. There were just very close relationships between these firms, and that's why I chose these subjects.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Just one quick comment. I guess the epilogue was very poignant for me that Jacob Schiff's descendants are now Episcopalian. And I was like, damn, you know, that saddened me, you know, to read that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the undercurrents of the story of many German Jewish families is that, you know, a lot of the, you know, second and third generations were striving to assimilate in the United States as there was, you know, rising anti-Semitism. And, you know, as you had, you know, fellows like Mortimer Schiff, who were one of the richest men. Mortimer Schiff was Jacob's son, one of the most, you know, the richest men in the United States, famous investment banker, but who could not become a member of certain clubs because he was Jewish. So, you know, there was definitely a trend towards assimilate, you know, and some members of these families, some of these sons and daughters grew up, they weren't even aware that they were Jewish. You know, they celebrated Christmas, even in the 1920s and 1930s. So in many cases, they were sort of moving away from Judaism. The very interesting thing about the Schiff family is that, you know, there were, you know, during Schiff's time, there were two very distinct branches of Wall Street. There was Jewish Wall Street, and then there were the sort of Yankee blue blood firms like J.P. Morgan. And, you know, the Schiffs ended up marrying into the Baker family, and George Baker was the dean of the sort of Yankee bankers. So this is how they become Episcopalians.
Okay, just took me a second to to do all the admin here. So, is there anything that you want to, what do you have coming up next? What's your next project? That's actually.
You know, I'm still trying to find the exact right thing. It's just, you know, this can be such a long process, and you have to live with it, and your family has to live with it. So you want to make sure it's absolutely the right thing. You know, I still remain fascinated by the World War I time frame because so much of the world as it is today flowed from that period, whether it's, you know, even the geography of the world, which was really, you know, decided at the bargaining table at the Paris Peace Conference. So I'm prospecting for stories within that time frame. But you know, I might do something totally different, and you know, there's a couple sort of like espionage stories that I would like to write as well. So that could happen.
Wow. Well, we'll look forward to it. And I want to be sensitive to time and grateful for your time. This was totally fascinating. I think I know from the number of questions that there is, and I had heard beforehand that a lot of the folks who, you know, have been not only had read the book, but were talking about it and were excited about it because they've enjoyed it so much. So was an incredible opportunity to get to talk to you, Daniel. So, and if you haven't read the book yet, I want to just remind people that the book is called The Money Kings, the epic story of the Jewish immigrants who transformed Wall Street and shaped modern America. You can get it in your local bookstore. Unfortunately, our local bookstore has closed, but all of us have a phone and we can order it on Amazon if we haven't already, or anywhere you get your books. And Bill, is there something you want to add?
Well, as president of the library board, you also can get it at the library.
Yeah, but we want to sell the book, so
Oh, okay. No.
so
Well, we have a bunch of copies.
No, go to the library. You can go to the library. That's fine.
Libraries are wonderful, but we want to sell the books. So
Yes, okay,
so
you're right.
There's
forgot where I
also
was.
Theodore's books in Oyster Bay if you just want a little bit of a drive.
Yeah, if you don't mind driving, Theodore's Books is a great independent bookstore, and we're always happy. And it's a priority for us to support them. So with that being said, I want to thank everyone. I want to remind everyone just of a couple of things really quickly, which is one is that the high holidays, I don't know if you heard, but they're coming up next week. And at Port Jewish Center, we don't ever charge for tickets. We have an open door policy, except the open door policy gets opened as soon as you register. For security reasons, we just need you to register in advance. Even if you're a member of Port Jewish Center, please register so that we can just plan accordingly for security reasons. And a reminder that our main services will take place at the United Methodist Church on Middle Neck Road. I also just want to let you know that we have two talks coming up after the holidays, Cracking the Nazi Code by Jason Bell on October 30th, and In the Shadow of the Greenbrier by Emily Matchar. And both of these books are book club books. Which means that we'll have a 3 o'clock discussion before an 8 o'clock talk. I thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Daniel, thank you so much for everything. This was
my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You can see everyone's applauding because we really, really enjoyed ourselves.
Great.
Early happy new year to everyone. Bye-bye and good night.